money is under our collective agency, whereas clean air and oxygen is not. But the sad thing is that in our everyday lives, it seems like we have mixed this up, and with that, we actually believe the opposite, that we somehow believe that the planetary boundaries are up for negotiation, whereas the market forces we just have to obey, when it's, of course, the opposite.
That's Welcome to another episode of the Name It podcast. I am your host, Jonas Oganovsky. This podcast is all about exploring and naming the deeper meanings, metaphors, and insights underneath our guests' passions, projects, and professions. I sit down with people from all walks of life to find out what brings them alive. This is the fourth in a special series exploring the reimagining of education. Rather than prescribing answers or singular solutions, my aim is to talk to people from all areas of education, to learn and explore with my guests emerging questions, challenges, and opportunities. This is the first of a two-part episode with my guest today, Tomas Björkman. After many years in business as an entrepreneur and investment banker, Tomas Björkman is now a social entrepreneur and the founder of the Equaret Foundation in Stockholm. He is also the co-founder of the Research Institute Perspectiva in London, of the Co-Creation Loft and the media platform Emerge in Berlin, the 29k.org digital personal development platform, and the Inner Development Goals, or IDGs, framework. He is a member of the Club of Rome and a fellow of the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Science. He is the author of 3 books: The Market Myth, published in 2016, The Nordic Secret, together with Lena Rachel Anderson in 2017, and The World We Create in 2019. Tomas divides his time between London, Stockholm, and Berlin. We talk about the importance of lifelong learning and inner growth and maturation in organizations, management, and in society, nurturing environments that can facilitate effective and healthy corporate cultures, the connection between inner and outer personal development and individual and collective growth and capacity. We talk about healthy democracy and societal change, oxygen and money as a metaphor for what we collectively believe we can reinvent, collective agency and collective sense-making, the value and limitation of rational scientific worldviews, what skills, knowledge, and capacities does education need to foster to meet global and environmental challenges and societal shifts, and how inner development goals are important in our meeting the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, and many other topics. Please welcome Tomas Björkman. Welcome, Tomas, to the podcast. It's really great. I'm very honored to have you on. Have been following your work for a little while and thought it'd be great to have a conversation. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Jonas, for having me on. Thank you.
So I'd like to start for the listeners who are not familiar with your work and some of your background. If you could give a bit of a sort of an origin story or a description of the work that you do, maybe a little bit about your background and how that's brought you to your current interest in broader systemic change to meet some of the global challenges.
Sure. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. So I'm Swedish. I was born in 1958 in a small Swedish rural town and grew up very much on the countryside, and had the opportunity to connect very early with nature and with environment. Realized quite early in life that I had a talent for mathematics and physics. So I was the first in my family to go to university, and I studied mathematics and physics. And those subjects came fairly easy to me, so I thought that I would pursue an academic career in physics. But then also the business world was calling me. So I changed quite abruptly from the academic environment into the business world, and have been a serial entrepreneur in IT, property, and in banking. Built a banking business in Scandinavia and later in Switzerland, which I sold in the beginning of the 2000s. Had to commit to remain as chairman of the banking group in Scandinavia for some years and being on the board of directors of the Swiss bank for some years. But when that contract ended in 2006, I was very happy to leave both the financial world and the business world. And I had the opportunity to set up my own foundation in Stockholm, the Oak Island Foundation, Stiftelsen Ekskärdet, and really try to focus both intellectually but also very practically on the connection between personal inner growth and development and societal change. And when I started the foundation some almost 15 years ago now, then this was very exotic. Inner development and societal change, most people did not understand at all what I was getting at. And one could ask oneself, how did I come into contact into these areas, and why did this start to interest me? And the background there is that I had the luck and the privilege to work with some very talented leadership development consultants who showed me and my management team in the bank the importance of not just lifelong learning, but also lifelong growth and maturation. Some people in the educational space make a difference between horizontal learning and vertical development. So the horizontal learning I was very familiar with, but then starting to explore with myself and my management team how we could help each other through the help of these very talented leadership development consultants to grow both cognitively and emotionally. And that, of course, helped us in the business world, but we all also noticed how this helped us in our family lives and private lives. And it also opened up, at least for myself, the horizons to care about more parts of the world, not just the business world, but the world outside the society, care about the planet, care about future generations. So that was a very eye-opening experience to me, coming from a very natural science and business world to go through that process. And then, of course, it's very easy to ask oneself then the question, as I did, if we in the business world, or at least in part of the business world, realize the importance of not just lifelong learning, but lifelong growth and inner maturation, and we even spend money and valuable time in supporting this development in our top management, how come then that we are not at all talking about that in society? So in society, we are starting to talk about lifelong learning of facts and skills, but supporting this general developmental journey, we are not really talking about. And then also having the opportunity to work with some other also very gifted consultants in organizational development who showed us the importance about corporate culture and how important it is for any larger corporation to really pay attention to your corporate culture, and also realizing that you cannot, as a management, manage or implement a certain corporate culture, but you can certainly try to create an environment which can facilitate the growth of a positive corporate culture. And again, asking the same question, if we in the business world realize the importance of corporate culture and how difficult it can be to handle that in terms of, for example, when you're trying to merge different organizations and creating a multicultural, even corporate culture. How come that we are not at all talking about societal culture in the same way? And that one of the most important aspects of political leadership might be to not command or implement a culture, but create a holding culture, a holding environment in which a positive multicultural society might grow. So that was really my starting point into the inner worlds of us individuals, in the inner world of society. And then also starting to explore the connection between the two. There are organizational consultants who point out that in order to be able to hold, replicate, and develop a deeper, more complex, more perhaps multicultural corporate culture, that puts demands on the participants in that corporation to have developed those inner capacities to actually be able to hold that culture. So there is somehow a connection between the corporate culture or the societal culture and the maturation of those who participate in that culture. And if you draw that out to the end, then one might even argue that in order for us to be able to have a healthy democracy, you need a certain level of the emotional and cognitive capacities within the society for that to be able to operate. So that was my background and the starting point and my inroad into this very interesting field of personal development and societal change.
Yeah, thank you. I find it a really interesting story and sort of pathway that you've journeyed through, sort of coming from your origins in Sweden and I think growing up on a farm in Sweden, and then the interest in engineering and mathematics and then finance, very much that sort of corporate systemic world. And some could argue comes with a particular worldview that can sort of grow through those experiences and those approaches.
Yes.
And now finding yourself sort of looking more towards those inner dimensions, not at the exclusion of those outer systemic dimensions, but how do they play that part? How are they important in supporting the growth of an equitable, multicultural, sustainable future through while not getting sort of lost in just trying to develop those outer goals. And I think this might be a really continue. Keep going.
No, I was just going to say that I've always been very curious, and that was what drew me into academia in the first place. And I've always been fascinated of how we can understand our world, and also the strength of the scientific perspective, the strength of the natural science perspective. But I also discovered fairly early in business that the neoclassical economic models that I studied at university, I also studied some economics before switching into business, that those models that try to model the economy or the market with natural science tools, that they are not that helpful in really understanding what is going on. So you could say that through my efforts of trying to be an entrepreneur in the business world trying to understand the market, I found the traditional economic models very, very limited, and found that it was much, much more helpful, even from a business point of view, to try to understand the business world and the market from a sociological perspective and a psychological perspective, realizing that we as actors in this world, we are not those super rational, all-informed agents that the standard economic models presume we are. But in reality, we are acting in very, very different ways. And also the fact from sociology that the market and the economy is not a natural system. It's not something given by nature or given by God. The market and the economy is a human invention. It's a human construct that has been developing rapidly over the last couple of 100 years only. And when you see that and you realize that even the free market could be very, very different, then yeah, that was my approach in. And that's also why I called the first book I wrote, The World We Create, putting an emphasis on that most of the factors in our human worlds that we encounter every day, 80%, 90% of that world is constructed by us humans and could be different. Yes. I could perhaps take that's quite abstract, but I could take a concrete example there and
Sure.
Contrasting the human world to the natural world, and say that for me as an individual in the Western world today, to survive, I need, amongst many other things, I need air to breathe, I need oxygen, and I need money. And for me as an individual, these two aspects of our world, that I need oxygen and that I need money, meets me as two facts that I need to relate to. But on a very fundamental basis, there is a huge difference between oxygen and money. So, for example, even if the whole of the world came together and decided that all humans of the world came together and decided we do not want to be dependent on oxygen any longer, we couldn't do anything about that. But if all of humanity came together, or even just a majority in a nation state came together and said, we don't want to be dependent on money any longer, then money could be gone tomorrow. Of course, we would probably, for practical reasons, have to replace it with some other ways of allocating our goods and services. But money and the market as we know it could be gone tomorrow.
And so that's the invention by humankind side of it.
Yeah, and that we created it, and we create it deliberately, but also by a lot of decisions that have just been taken by random through history. We ended up with the market as it is. Now, it's important to say again that this realization that the market is just a collective invention, it is part of our collective imaginary, that does not help me as an individual. Because even with that realization, when I go to the supermarket and I'm at the cashier desk, and the cashier tells me, this is what you need to pay. If I say, well, money is just a human invention, it's just part of our collective imaginary, that won't help me, because the police might come and put me in jail for trying to steal. Or even as, for example, Michael Foucault has pointed out, even other societal functions and institutions help us to enforce this collective imaginary, not just the law, but if I totally insist on the world being just a fantasy, I could even be put in mental hospital. So even our mental hospital system keeps enforcing this collective imaginary. Okay, so why is this important? Well, it's important because then we realize that even if we as individuals do not have any agency in changing the collective imaginary, things like money on the market, we do have a collective agency. There are things that we can change if we exercise collective agency that we can't change as individuals. And during the last couple of decades, I would say that we have been generally in the Western world better and better empowered in exercising our individual agency, whereas collective agency we become worse and worse at exercising, not the least because in order to be able to exercise collective agency, we first need to have collective sense-making, and collective sense-making is breaking down today. And of course, we can tie that to education in a moment. I should just make one final comment on this, on this metaphor, and that is, so we realize that money is under our collective agency, whereas clean air and oxygen is not. But the sad thing is that in our everyday lives, it seems like we have mixed this up, and with that, we actually believe the opposite, that we somehow believe that the planetary boundaries are up for negotiation, whereas the market forces we just have to obey, when it's, of course, the opposite.
That's a very interesting question. We could easily get lost in. That'd be very tempting. It's some really interesting metaphors and sort of tracks we went down there. One term that I heard you make was was it the social imaginaries or collective imaginaries?
Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit about what Yeah, could you speak a little bit about what those are?
Well, it is really all of those collective agreements, explicit or implicit, or even the subconscious agreements that we have that makes the world operate. Okay, so gravitation and oxygen would still be here on Earth even if we didn't have any humans. But in order for our society to operate, and this was really the case even in the very early dawn of humanity, we have invented a lot of things that we collectively believe in. And because we collectively believe in them, they appear real to us. And money is one example. But there are many, many other examples, of course, like nation states, presidents, marriage, to name a few. And all of those are just human invention. They do not exist in nature. They only exist because we believe in those things and that we collectively enforce them. Some we enforce by legal arrangement, and some just by tradition. And when we start to see that nation states, marriage, presidents, money, and many, many other things are just sometimes quite random collective agreements that usually in history had played an important role and might have served some good purpose historically, or just some good purpose for a dominating minority who invented those things. Can include kings and dukes and bishops and religions, and of course religions and God and all of those things are in this space.
Yes.
And usually we have invented them because they served some purpose. And religion, for example, some sociologists say, and I think there's a lot of truth in that, that we invented religion, the monotheistic religions, because that really helped us to be able to coordinate larger groups of people when we were moving from the small hunter-gatherer societies where everyone knew each other. And we tried to form the first states and city-states with perhaps tens or even hundreds of thousands of people. Then you needed to have new coordination mechanism to keep those societies together, and their religion played an important role.
Yeah.
Just like today, keeping the world together, the market plays a very, very important role in keeping that together and making it possible for us to even have business transactions internationally even with our enemies. Even in this conflict today in Europe, we are still trading with Russia.
Yeah, I mean, it's a topic well out of my sphere of understanding and knowledge, but it's a good point. There was something I just wanted to sort of come back to before we do move towards how does all this relate potentially to education, even in the broadest conception.
Yeah, and it does. And it does very much.
Absolutely. I think very much. And it's good kind of having built this sort of foundation background, which I did want to do. And that was just that coming back to the analogy and the difference between oxygen and money. And I just wanted to sort of think out loud a little bit here, see what you think about this, and you can respond, which is that, yes, in very many ways, something like money or debt, when it was first conceived or started to emerge, because I believe in some schools of thought, there's no such thing as a first single appearance of any new phenomena or invention. It sort of happens often in a very emergent, distributed way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I just thought,
I'm sure we had some sort of concept of debt even in Stone Age. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was just thinking, so that initially it's invented by humans in this case. And so it has very different qualities from air. So it's, in some way, it could be that if there was some kind of collective agreement, and at the moment, I think it's granted that you and me are sort of using this as thought experiment, and we're aware of real difficulties to do something like let's all agree
absolutely.
that money doesn't exist.
Absolutely.
However, after those initial emergent inventions of that collective imaginary, such as money, the way we conceive of ourselves, the way we relate culturally, relationally, emotionally, and even physically, so that the institutions and the systems that start to form around, or the rituals that start to form around that original imagined phenomenon such as money, those start to form in a way their own concrete realities in some sense that have almost like cultural or systemic gravity on our own. And as you point, I think an example is with the cashier. So there's still those realities that kind of
no,
back.
absolutely. And another example of that would be that even if the nation state is just an invented idea. When I was visiting Lithuania during summer, I went up against the border towards Kaliningrad, which is Russia. And of course, there you hit the barbed wire. Okay? You hit the barbed wire, and we even had a border patrol approaching us, saying that you can't go closer to the border than this. So, of course, these ideas take on a very tangible reality in many cases that you hit up against. But again, it's important to remember that the origin is with us humans, and we could decide to change it. We could tear down the borders. We could tear down the wall.
And I think that's a really important point, actually, and one that I agree with. And perhaps we can use this as sort of the branching off point to start to take us in the direction of how this relates to education in the broadest sense, which is, if we take this particular topic of having invented something like money, and the system and the markets around which it orients and manifests, is that we could reinvent it potentially. So there's that opportunity to, we are impacted individually and collectively daily, some more than others, by the very real climate and world that those inventions have brought about, such as money and the market. And the same could be said for forms of education and what kind of skill sets were valued and encouraged when our current educational system was introduced, and that we can, and I would argue, and perhaps you might agree, start to reinvent that in all
absolutely
different locales around the world. And there's a strong gravitational, I almost think of it like with a black hole, there's an event horizon, or the event horizon, or the gravitational pull of when you first escape the Earth in a rocket. I think a certain large percentage of fuel and energy is used up in getting away from that strong gravity, after which new system change, new changes of ways of doing education is possible.
And I completely agree with what you said. And I think one could make an even stronger claim today, and that is that I believe that we are right now very close to, again, in the history of humanity, a transition point where we are transitioning from one system into another. And one of the reasons why humanity is still around after so many thousands of years is that we have had the ability to change our worldview and our collective reality fundamentally a number of times. And we have already mentioned that when we went from being small groups of hunter-gatherers and then trying to create large cities or small nation states, we needed to invent some sort of social function, some social glue that would help us to keep those societies together, as our instincts were not enough, as our instincts were created over millions of years. Then our instincts have essentially not shifted, but our culture has shifted. And the last time we had such a deep cultural shift in the Western world, I would argue, was during the Enlightenment, when we went from a religious, dogmatic worldview into a scientific, rationalistic worldview. And that was the start of the Industrial Revolution and all of that. And essentially, we have been living in that worldview and that culture, that collective imaginary, since the Enlightenment. And I think we should be very grateful for that approach to the world, because that rationalistic, scientific approach has given us everything from modern medicine to human rights and democracy. And we wouldn't want to be without that. But at the same time, I think that we can all see how this approach to the world is running out of steam. And some would even argue that the worst problems that we are facing, such as now the breakdown of democracy and the global environmental challenges, that they might actually be an effect of that particular worldview. So again, I'm a scientist. I know the strength of the scientific perspective. So I think it would be unwise to get rid of that perspective, just like we during the Enlightenment just got rid of religion. I think we should keep that perspective, but that we should realize the limitations of that perspective, and that has to be complemented with other ways of knowing and understanding. And if that is true, that we are actually standing in front of such a substantial societal shift, then of course we as individuals in this society, we need other skills, other knowledges, other capacities than the typical inhabitant that lived in the society 50 years ago or 100 years ago. That even if we back then perceived a very rapid technological development, it was essentially the same society that we were living in. So now, if we have a shift like this, then we need to, first of all, in education, make everyone aware of the fact that the world is shifting and that it is possible to recreate and reimagine such things as the nation state, marriages, money, the market, political system, and that most of those things might even be up for grabs, and that just knowing that is empowering people to be able to step into a more creative role. So how can we, instead of the way that our school system today has been set up in socializing people into a specific world and specific worldview, which we of course still need to do, but on top of that, have a constructive, critical view on our world, and knowing that we all are actually the creators of this world every day, when we are either replicating or recreating this world, whether we know it or not. And if that would be the basis for, if we took that as our basis when we...
Speaking of a form of education that may still need to include the preparing of young people for a particular capacity to live well and live meaningful lives, that can include a worldview that comes with that. Could you speak a little bit about one of the projects that you helped to found or have some involvement in around the Inner Development Goals project?
Yes,
that's
yes.
Related to the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the first thing I should say is that whether you believe or not that we are in for a fundamental societal shift due to what is happening right now with the technological development, not the least what is happening in the field of AI and the blockchain technology and those things that would make it possible. I mean, blockchain technology makes it possible not just to invent cryptocurrencies, which is essentially same money but digitally, but could actually open the door to having possibilities of really reinventing the market and getting beyond the money and having completely new ways of making the economy clear. So the technological development is moving so quickly, even if you might not, like I do, believe that we are facing a very deep societal transformation. At least everyone would agree with me that the technological development that we see now is so rapid and transformative that we can really not have any idea about what practical skills or what trades we should educate young people into.
If you enjoyed or learned from this episode, please subscribe and follow on wherever you listen to your podcasts so you never miss an episode.